I live in, California. Yeah. San Mateo, so about near San Francisco. Oh, okay. Yeah, very near Berkeley.
When I was kind of disappeared here for a while. And it was a song that I wrote because I wanted everybody to know that.
Iniziamo con qualche minuto di ritardo perché ci sono ancora persone che stanno prendendo le cuffie per la traduzione, perché la conferenza è in inglese, per cui se qualcuno vuole andare a prendere le cuffie per la traduzione che sono fuori può ancora farlo. Buongiorno a tutti, grazie per essere qui oggi. Iniziamo l'ultima conferenza del mattino del Mantova Food&SCIENCE Festival. Sono contentissimo di essere qui al Teatro Scientifico di Biena per introdurvi una persona che coniuga la scienza e il cibo. Ho il piacere di presentarvi Kenji Lopez, è uno chef ma usa la scienza per migliorare la cucina. Lui è il Managing Culinary Director di un sito web americano molto famoso e conosciutissimo da tutti gli appassionati di cucina, anche italiani, che si chiama Serious Eats. Ha lavorato in precedenza per una rivista molto famosa, anche questa per appassionati, che si chiama Cooks Illustrated, e ha lavorato anche per un programma televisivo che è America's Test Kitchen. Io sono un fanatico, ho tutte le stagioni perché è veramente interessante. Oggi è qui anche nella veste di autore, perché lui ha scritto un libro che presenterà e vi parlerà di alcune cose tratte dal libro, che è veramente un tomo monumentale, ed è schizzato primo in classifica negli Stati Uniti con il suo The Food Lab, Better Home Cooking Through Science, cioè il laboratorio del cibo, una migliore cucina casalinga attraverso la scienza. A differenza di altre persone che invece si sono dedicate all'utilizzo della scienza per migliorare la cucina dei ristoranti stellati famosi, che usano spesso ingredienti non accessibili al pubblico comune, a noi pasticcioni casalinghi, la scienza può servire anche per migliorare anche un piatto di spaghetti, degli hamburger, delle zuppe e un sacco di altre cose. Per cui oggi Kenji ci farà alcuni esempi. Ci siamo messi un po' d'accordo perché io oggi, stasera, tempo permettendo, parlerò di carne, di cottura della carne, con una grigliata e un barbecue all'esterno alle 7:30, per cui lui parlerà anche di carne, ma anche di altri aspetti che invece io stasera non toccherò. Quindi ho il piacere di lasciare il palco a Kenji per la sua chiacchierata. Alla fine faremo qualche domanda.
Okay, thank you. Grazie, grazie. Hello. How many people here speak English? Okay, that's a lot. Good. Okay. So I was going to say if all of my jokes are terrible, I was just going to blame the translator, but no, you'll get them. You're going to find them very hilarious. Yeah, I came here today, last night from Bologna. I'm with my wife and my mother and my daughter. I just had a daughter 10 weeks ago, and that was a very nerve-wracking experience. I was very nervous before it happened, but I'm actually a little bit more nervous today because I'm American in Italy, and I'm about to speak about Italian food to a room full of Italians. And I've talked to Italians about Italian food before, and it can be nerve-wracking. I think because there's very few countries. I think out of every country in the world, Italians are probably the most proud, probably rightfully most proud of their food out of anybody in the world. But I think Italians also like to argue more than anybody in the world. And if you deny it, you're just proving my point right now. So we're going to talk about Italian food and some other things today. So the question I want to talk about first is why science? Why introduce science to food? Because food is one of these things. Food and cooking is one of these things that traditionally gets passed down generationally. It may be something that you learn from your grandmother or your father, or maybe a chef teaches to their apprentice. And you learn to cook by the method of your master. So there's this master-apprentice relationship to cooking, typically. I think that for a lot of people in my generation, maybe certainly in the U.S. and probably in Italy as well, I think there's a very large number of people of my age who grew up in families where either both parents worked or there wasn't this strong tradition of family recipes. So in the U.S., we don't have as much of this strong regional cooking and as much of this sort of idea of food as culture. And so a lot of people my age grew up not learning how to cook by that method. They didn't learn the recipes of their family. And so for me, the science of cooking is a way to explain how cooking works to someone who didn't necessarily grow up that way. And I think even for someone who does have that background in cooking, understanding the science behind it gives them a completely different perspective into it. So today when I was coming here, so we're staying at the Hotel Casa Poli, and right now we're here, the Teatro del Bibbiena. Pardon all of my pronunciation, by the way. And when I was trying to get here this morning, I went onto my phone and I got a map, and I asked it, how do I get from my hotel to here? And this is what it told me. So basically walk 750 meters that way, go 13 meters that way. Very, very simple. And this is essentially a recipe to get from point A to point B. It's a very simple recipe. Maybe this is the equivalent of saying a recipe for boiled water. Fill the pot with water, put it on the heat. That's about it. Very, very simple. But things can get a little bit more complicated than this. So my wife and I tomorrow are going to be driving. We're spending the next 3 weeks in Italy and Slovenia and Austria, and so we're going to be driving around a lot. So tomorrow, or maybe in a few days, we're going to be driving to Slovenia, to Bled. And the directions to get there are a lot more complicated. SR62, go 2 kilometers this way, 350 meters that way, 1.3 kilometers this way, and it becomes a very, very, very complicated process, 20, 30 steps. So this is the way that I think a recipe works. It's a step-by-step process that tells you how to get from one point to the other. But the problem is that it doesn't give you an idea of the bigger picture. It doesn't really tell you, for instance, this morning, for instance, when we were walking here, we had the baby with us. And there's a section of the road that was cobblestones, a very, very rough street. So we actually couldn't go directly the way that the map told us to go, and we had to take the directions told us to go. So we had to take a route around. Now, if all we had was the step-by-step directions, we would have been lost. We wouldn't really have known how to go there. But fortunately, we had a map. We didn't just have the step. We actually had a map of the whole area, so we could say, all right, this is where we're trying to go. This route is blocked, so let's take this route instead. And that to me is what understanding the science is. So a recipe is the step-by-step instructions, but understanding the science of cooking, understanding the technique, understanding is sort of like having a map. And the more you understand the science, the bigger the picture you get on the map. I don't know why there's supposed to be some kind of video playing, but oh well. The better the picture you get. So understanding these kinds of techniques and understanding the science, having this map, having this culinary map, it gives you a lot more freedom. It empowers you to interpret the food the way you want to. It allows you to adapt to more situations. So rather than just saying, starting from this specific point A to get to this specific point B, it allows you to say, go from point A to point C, or find a different route to point B, find a faster route. Say there's a dish that typically takes 2 hours to cook, but you want to be able to make it on Wednesday evening after you come home from work and you only have 1 hour. Well, understanding the science of the cooking will tell you whether it's possible to do this, and might even give you insight in a way to find a shortcut. In the same way that understanding a neighborhood will tell you, I can get to here from this route or that route. It doesn't really matter as long as I get from where I am to where I'm going. It might also show you that maybe I don't want to go to Slovenia. Maybe I want to go to Switzerland. And if I have a map, I'll know the difference between Slovenia and Switzerland and how to get to each one of those places. So that to me is what science does for you in the kitchen. It empowers you. It allows you to make the decisions and be in control of your food, as opposed to you being this sort of slave to the step-by-step recipes and the traditions. So I'm going to talk about how this applies to a few different types of foods. I'm going to start with pizza. So I grew up in New York, and in New York we have pizza. It's different from the pizza that they have in Napoli, but I think good also. But different. So this is not really New York style pizza. This is more a Neapolitan style pizza. Now, I'm sure many of you have been to Napoli and had the pizza there. It's different from what you get up here as well. In Napoli, the pizza, the way it's cooked is in a very, very, very hot oven. It requires wood fire. It's very, very simple, but it requires this special equipment. At home, we don't have that special equipment. At least most people don't have a stone oven with a wood fire inside their home. And so the question is, how can we make this style of pizza in our home oven, or how can we at least get close to that? Well, to answer this question, first we have to understand a little bit about how cooking works. Fundamentally, cooking is the transfer of energy, the application of energy from one source to your food. That's what cooking is. You're taking energy from a heat source and you're applying it to your food, and through that you're causing certain reactions to take place. Now, a pizza oven or your stovetop or anything, a source of energy, I find it useful to think of it sort of as a tap. Like you can turn on the water. The more powerful your oven is or the more powerful the stovetop is, the bigger the flow of water coming out of it. So there's energy flowing out of it. When you apply that energy to food, let's talk about what happens when you do it to pizza. There's a number of things that happen. So the first thing is that the energy is going to cause water vapor and air to expand. So when you take a piece of pizza dough and it's been stretched out flat, inside are very small bubbles of carbon dioxide created by the yeast, and there's also pockets of moisture. When you first put that in the oven, lots of energy goes into the pizza crust. That carbon dioxide expands, the liquid turns into water vapor, and that's what causes the pizza crust to puff up. Once the pizza crust puffs up a bit, that's when the exterior starts to dry out. So you see the very outer layers, the bottom of the pizza, the edge of the pizza, the liquid evaporates and the pizza starts to get dry. After that, it starts to brown. Well, the proteins in it set, the proteins in the flour will set, and then they start to brown, and that's what gives you those sort of black spots on a pizza. So this is a thing that requires very, very high heat. Well, it doesn't require it, but when you have very, very high heat, it happens in a very specific way. So a pizza oven in Napoli would be about, 900 degrees Fahrenheit, about 500 degrees Celsius. Much hotter than a home oven can get. My home oven maxes out at about 280 degrees Celsius, something like that. Almost half the temperature. So first of all, okay, so let's see. So when you have very high temperature, your pizza crust ends up looking like this. And I think this is a good-looking pizza. It you see these very dark spots and very light spots. In English, we call it leopard spotting. I don't know what you call it in. Same. Okay. And, so leopard spotting is what you want to see on a pizza crust. The reason this happens, there's a couple reasons. One of them is the gas is expanding. You'll see that the dark spots are all little bubbles. So as the gases expand, they cause these bubbles to puff out. The dough becomes very thin on those areas, and so it cooks more rapidly on those areas, and those areas get darker. That effect is compounded by the fact that they're sticking out of the dough. So if you have a relatively low heat source, like say a candle, and you hold your two hands like this, one of them in front of the other, and the candle's here. You're not going to feel that big a temperature differential between this hand and this hand, maybe a few degrees. Not that big of a difference. But if you have a very big fire in front of you, you're standing in front of a fireplace, when you go like this and go like this hand is going to feel much hotter than this hand. And that's sort of one of the general principles of cooking, is that the higher the temperature, the faster you're pushing energy into something, the bigger the temperature differential is going to be between different parts of the food that's cooking. So that applies both to pizza like this, so the parts that stick out are getting much more heat than the parts that are recessed. It also applies to, for instance, if you're cooking like a turkey or a piece of roast beef, if you cook it in a very hot oven, the outside is going to be much hotter than the very center, and you're going to get this very large gradient of heat. Whereas if you cook it in a lower oven, you get a much more even gradient of heat. And if you take that to the extreme, you end up with sous vide cooking, which is sort of the modern method of cooking, where you're cooking at exactly the temperature that you want to serve it, and there you get zero gradient. It's all 100% evenly cooked edge to center. But anyhow, that's what causes this leopard spotting. High heat also gets you this very nice texture difference between the very outside of super thin, almost like a thin eggshell crust on the outside, but very soft and springy on the inside, which you can see if this plays. Nope. Uh-oh. I don't know what I did there. Oops. All right, we're going back. Well, the videos might not all play, but anyhow, I promise you it looked really cool. If it played, it would have looked really cool. Okay. So it takes a large amount of energy to make this great pizza, a very fast transfer of energy. Unfortunately, even with a very big oak fire burning in there, the amount of energy that's putting out is not quite enough on its own to do it. So you have to have a way of storing that energy, sort of like a battery, something that'll store that energy for you so that you can apply it later on. So it helps to think of it as a bucket. An oven or a pan or anything that you're heating up and preheating is like a bucket that is storing that energy. It's keeping that energy in there until you want to use it. So a pizza, how does it cook? Well, it cooks in a few different ways, and the bottom of the pizza and the top of the pizza cook in two different ways. The bottom of the pizza cooks mainly through conduction, which is the direct transfer of energy from one solid body to another. So the pizza dough rests directly on the oven floor. The oven floor has collected energy from the fire, and that's what cooks the bottom of a pizza. The top of a pizza cooks through two other methods, radiation and convection. So convection is the flow of energy through a gaseous or a liquid body, something that flows. And so the hot air in the oven is moving around, and that's cooking the top of the pizza. You're also getting some amount of radiation from the dome of the oven, which has collected all this energy and then is radiating it back down, electromagnetic radiation. So it doesn't require air or contact at all. It's just direct electromagnetic radiation. So a stone is a bucket. It's a pretty big bucket. It has a relatively large volumetric heat capacity. But the problem though, it has volumetric heat capacity is basically the amount of energy that you can store in like 1 cubic centimeter in a given volume of a material. Stone has relatively large volumetric heat capacity, but it has relatively low conductivity, which means that think of it sort of like a nipple on the top of your bucket. It's easy to store energy in it, but it's not that easy to get it out again. It comes out in drips. It comes out slowly. So what this means is that if you're trying to cook the same pizza at home in an oven that's at 280 degrees as opposed to at 500 degrees, it doesn't work very well. This is a pizza that was cooked on a stone in a home oven, 280 degrees, and you can see a very big difference. Rather than having this big contrast between light spots and dark spots, it's all even brown. Rather than cooking in 90 seconds, it cooks in about maybe 5 to 6 minutes. So it takes much longer to cook. So you get more even browning, which means less flavor development. And it also means that in that 5 to 6 minutes that it takes for it to get crispy, it also gets drier. So you end up with a much different style of pizza, something that's sort of more crisp and crackery. So the question is, what can you do at home to solve this problem? You can't make your oven hotter. You could maybe get a larger stone, but even a larger stone is still going to have a difficult time letting that energy out. The solution is actually something that Nathan Myhrvold and the team at Modernist Cuisine suggested in 2012, which was, well, traditional ovens use stone, but nobody says that we have to use stone. Instead, we'll use metal. There's this product out now called the baking steel, which is essentially just a steel slab that replaces the stone that you would put in your home oven. And steel has much better properties than for cooking pizza than stone does. So stone has a very high volumetric heat capacity. Steel has an extremely high volumetric heat capacity. Per cubic centimeter, it can hold much more energy. More importantly, it also conducts energy very, very well. So the interesting thing about this is that even at the same temperature, and this is actually a question that people sometimes ask me, is like, what temperature should my pan be when I'm searing a steak? And that's not a very good question to ask, because you shouldn't actually care much about temperature. What you really care about is energy flux, is the flow of energy the rate of energy transfer from one body to another. And that can vary greatly depending on the material that you're cooking in. So a pizza stone that's at 500 degrees will produce a pizza that's brown, takes a very slow energy transfer. But a pizza steel that's even lower temperature at 450 degrees will actually cook much faster than a stone that's at 500 degrees. And you can see this. I think everyone is familiar with this process in action. If you think about the difference between a pot of boiling water, which is at 100 degrees Celsius, and you put your hand in it and you burn yourself. It feels very, very hot. But you have an oven at 100 degrees Celsius. You can open it up. You can put your hand in there, no problem. They're both at the same temperature. One of them is transferring energy much faster than the other one. And it's the same process here. So it turns out that if you use steel, same temperature oven, same exact dough, you can get a much better looking pizza. So yeah, you end up with pizzas that look like that. This is all done in a home oven. So maybe not quite as good as what you'd get in an actual stone oven, but very close, I think. Much closer than I think was possible before this new tool was invented. I'm going to talk about risotto now. And I know that there's a local risotto from here that is dry or something, right? It's with beans, something like that. I haven't tried it, but is it worth trying? What's that? Oh, with sausages. Okay, okay, got it. Okay, okay. Pork chop. Okay, okay. But it's not. But it's not the. It's not alonda. It's not. It's.
Technically, it's not really a risotto because the rice is not toasted. But they
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, we're gonna. I see. I see. Okay. So the water gets completely absorbed. Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about toasting risotto. So the first restaurant that I worked at in Boston was actually a northern Italian restaurant. The chef there, Barbara Lynch, she spent a lot of time in northern Italy and then opened up a northern Italian restaurant in Boston. So my original training was actually in northern Italian cuisine. And you know, when I first started working at restaurants, so I came from a scientific background. My parents, my father and my grandfather were scientists. My education was very science-oriented, and I was going to be a scientist for a long time until I discovered that laboratory science is boring. No offense to any laboratory scientist, it's just not it wasn't the life for me. But so after a couple of years of working in biology labs, I spent a summer during college looking for a job, actually as a waiter, and it turns out that nobody wanted to hire a waiter who had zero experience. So it's a bootstrapping problem. Like you can't get a job as a waiter without experience, but you can't get experience as a waiter without a job. At least at the nice restaurants. So I couldn't get a job as a waiter, but it turns out that they will hire anyone to be a cook, even without experience. One of the restaurants I walked into, the manager there told me that the prep cook didn't show up that morning. And so if I could come in that afternoon and I could hold a knife, that I could have a job for the summer. And that's how I ended up cooking for the first time. I'd never really cooked in my life before that. Anyhow, from the moment I started working in restaurant kitchens, I always had these, you know, I was really, really annoying to the chef because I would always ask questions like, why are we doing it this way? Why are we toasting the risotto this way? Why are we adding all the liquid in little steps? All these questions, and the answer is always, just do it. Like, don't ask questions, just do it. Because that's the way, I mean, in a restaurant, it's about production, it's about speed, it's about repeatability. So there, you know, for better or worse, there isn't really much of an opportunity to ask these questions. So it wasn't until many years later when I had a job at Cooks Illustrated magazine where I really got the opportunity as a test cook to actually start answering some of these questions. Risotto is one that I had a lot of questions about. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the traditional way to make risotto, but just in case, I'll go over it. So you start by sautéing aromatics in fat. So generally, it'll be onions and garlic, or onions and shallots, some form of allium in a hot fat. So olive oil or butter or whatever, you know, pork lard, whatever fat you want to use. After you sauté those and get the flavor into the fat, then you add your rice. And it would be a short grain rice that you want to toast, and you toast it partly to develop flavor and partly to adjust the texture of it so that it stays al dente when you cook it. Next you start adding your broth, your wine and your broth in small increments, stirring the whole time until it comes out nice and creamy. And so, you know, as you're stirring it, the starch on the exterior of the rice gets washed off into the stock. As it heats up in that stock, the starch absorbs liquid, it activates, and it becomes thicker, and that's what thickens the sauce into the creamy texture. So you don't, you know, you get a very nice creamy sauce with rice without actually having to add any dairy cream. Now, my question was always about the toasting step. And for me, it was the question was always, all right, why do we toast it this amount? Like, why don't we toast it a little bit less, or why don't we toast it a little bit more? Why is it always this amount? And the answer is, well, you want to toast it to a certain level so that you develop flavor. But if you toast it too much, extended toasting can actually destroy starch so that it doesn't thicken up properly. So this is a very easy experiment you can do at home. Just get some rice and toast it and toast it and toast it until it turns nice. Actually, like it gets like a really nice nutty brown aroma, sort of you know, almost like toasted pine nuts. But you toast it until it gets really nice and dark brown, and then you make your risotto exactly the same way. And you'll find that what happens is that it doesn't get creamy. The starch gets deactivated. You end up with risotto that looks like this. The rice grains are individual, but there's no sauce. There's nothing to bind them together. So to me, this was an interesting problem because I actually really enjoy the flavor of that deeply toasted rice. I think it has a very interesting, very different flavor, but it loses all of the starch. So how do you solve this? The method that I use these days is to actually separate those two steps. So I take the rice. When the rice is still raw, I pour the stock over it. And then I kind of swish it around so that it washes off all of the excess starch. That way you can drain off all that extra liquid, and the liquid and the starch comes out, and you're left with just the rice without the starch. You can then take that rice and toast it until it's very, very deep brown, develops really, really nice flavors. And then you can toast it more deeply than you could traditionally. And then you take that starchy liquid and add it back and cook it as if you were cooking a traditional risotto. And so what you end up with is a risotto that has the proper texture, it has the proper creaminess, it has the rice is al dente, but it has a much deeper, more toasted flavor. So I'm not saying this is better than traditional risotto, but it's a different destination you can get to if you want to try something completely different while still maintaining some of the sort of traditional aspects of the dish. So now I am going to talk a little bit about some American food. Hamburgers. So I'm from the US, and I do like hamburgers. I find that, it is possible to take a dish from one country and bring it to another and successfully recreate it in a traditional way. It's also possible to successfully translate it into sort of an adapted local version of it. But still, I find that as many great Italian restaurants as there are in the U.S., there's something different about going to an Italian restaurant in Italy, and there's a certain feeling you get, and there's a certain way that things are cooked that is a little bit different from what you get in the U.S. Similarly, I find that I've eaten hamburgers in other countries, but it's never quite the same as when you get a good hamburger in the U.S. There's a number of different reasons for that. I think a lot of it has to do with the availability of ingredients, and that's the case with many cuisines. The beef in the U.S. Is fed on grass and corn, and so it tends to be very, very fatty, and the fat tends to run inside the meat, as opposed to the beef in South America and the beef in Europe tends to be much leaner. Usually has a stronger flavor because it tends to be fed more on grass than on grain, so it develops a stronger flavor, but it also tends to be leaner. And you can always, you can grind extra fat into your meat, but there's a very big difference between extra fat that is ground into it and fat that is already sort of part of the musculature. So it's I find it very difficult to find a great American hamburger outside of the U.S. But I'm going to talk about two different styles of hamburger here that I really enjoy. So the first one is sort of the classic backyard hamburger, which is one that you cook on a grill over a fire. This style, for me, is really, a lot of it is about that interplay between the exterior and the interior. So you want the meat to be juicy on the inside and flavorful and smoky on the outside. So deeply charred, but still tender and rare and juicy on the inside. I also like these burgers to be sort of loose in structure. So I want it to be extremely tender so that when you bite into it and you're cooking it, beef fat, the beef fat, one of the wonderful things about it is the way it softens as it heats up and starts to melt a little bit. So when you have a really great hamburger, for me, a really great thick hamburger, that fat is starting to melt and it's collecting in little sort of caves and caverns inside the meat, so that when you bite into it, it comes into your mouth and you feel that sort of like the delicious juices coming out. So you really want a burger to have a very loose structure, something that's going to give up that's going to hold on to its juices, but give them up very easily once you bite them. A burger also needs to be well seasoned. It needs to be salted well, and any food does. I think salt enhances flavor. Salt is what allows us to taste things properly. So a burger, for it to be really great, it does need to be salted quite well. So you would think that because of this, it might make sense to salt the meat and and work it into the burger so that the salt goes all the way throughout the entire patty from edge to center. The problem with this, though, is that salt actually can alter proteins. It does it in a few different ways. So mainly, it'll cause certain proteins to dissolve. In meat, that protein is myoglobin. In eggs, it'll cause ovalbumin, the protein in eggs, to dissolve. And you can see this, for example, here. 2 bowls of scrambled eggs here, and they're very different in color, right? One of them is very pale yellow. One of them is dark orange. I think the one on the left looks like American eggs, and the one on the right looks like Italian eggs. But really, the difference here, though, these are all the exact same eggs. The only difference is that one of them had some salt added to them, left to sit for about 15 minutes, and then scrambled up. And that's the only difference here. And what happens is that the salt breaks down the protein, so that when light hits it, it refracts less, so it looks a little bit darker, a little bit more clear. This actually has a big effect on the way they cook as well. So if you think about eggs, when they're raw, their protein structure is very loose and fluid. As they start to cook, proteins start to tighten up, and they end up tangling with each other, and that's what causes eggs to coagulate. If you cook them too much, the protein structure tightens so much that it'll start to push out liquid, and your eggs will start to weep. So you can see this happen in scrambled eggs or in an omelet or any type of cooked eggs. If you overcook it, the liquid starts to come out. Salting the egg will actually help it retain liquid a lot better because that protein structure doesn't tighten up as much as it cooks. So if you want to serve, if you're having guests over for breakfast or brunch and you want to serve the best scrambled eggs ever, salt them about 15 minutes beforehand, before you scramble them, and they'll come out much more tender. If you have some orange food coloring, it also makes people think it tastes better. So salted proteins tend to form looser cooked structures. This is true in the case of eggs. It's also true in this case of other meats. So here is 2 chicken cutlets, breaded and fried. Again, the only difference here is that one of them was salted and left to sit for about half an hour, and the other one was not. Was salted immediately before cooking. And it's a little bit hard to see, I think, on this projector, but the one on the left, it ends up with a much smoother, much juicier structure. It retains moisture a lot better than the one on the right, which comes out drier and loses more moisture. And this is actually a measurable effect. So if you've heard of the concept of brining, which is where you take chicken or turkey or a pork chop or something and put it in salted water for half an hour or even overnight before cooking. What this does is that it breaks down some of the muscle proteins so that when the meat subsequently cooks, it doesn't squeeze as much and more moisture stays inside it. And it's measurable. I think meat that isn't brined, if you cook it to, this is chicken or turkey or any kind of poultry meat, if you cook it to 65 degrees Celsius, when it's not brined, it loses about 15 to 17% or so of its weight in water. If you do brine it, either by salting or by soaking it in salt water, it ends up only losing about 10% of its weight. So it's a measurable difference. So salted proteins tend to contract less, which sounds like a good thing, but salted proteins are also a lot stickier, and they tend to cross-link to each other a lot more. So if you've ever had, I'm sure everybody here has had salumi, or like a salami or a mortadella, something with meat that has been salted and then pressed together. Even though it's been ground up, it doesn't fall apart. It sticks together very tightly, and that sticking action is only through the action of salt. That's meat proteins that are dissolving and then cross-linking with each other. So when you take meat and you salt it and you mash it around, it forms a very, very tight structure, which is not what you want in a hamburger. It's what you want in a sausage, but not what you want in a hamburger. And I don't know if these videos will play this time. Oh yeah. So we did this. Normally I would get someone from the audience to come up and we'd throw some hamburgers around. But I felt a little self-conscious throwing hamburgers in a place like this. So instead, I'm just going to show you a video. This is I took a baseball pitching machine and adapted it to throw hamburgers at about 70 kilometers per hour, well, 45 miles per hour. Against a wall. And so I want to first show you what happens if you throw. That's a hamburger patty that is unsalted, so just meat very gently formed into a patty, flung against a wall at 45 miles per hour. I think that's like 70, 75 kilometers per hour. It blows apart. It turns into many pieces, and that's, I think, a very good thing with a hamburger. If you do the same thing with a hamburger patty that has been salted, there is a drastic difference. So you can see this one, it hits there and it barely falls apart. It maybe splits a little bit, but it just falls straight down. And that's something that, I mean, this is going at 45 miles an hour. You can imagine that in your mouth, you're going to feel that as well. One of them is going to be tender and loose and juicy. The other one's going to be like a sausage. The moral of the story is if you're making a thicker hamburger, you want to handle your meat very gently and not salt it. Only salt the exterior, not the interior. This is what time is it right now? How much time do I have? I'm good? Okay. Okay, good. All right, so this is the other style of burger, and this is a burger I think I actually prefer. Probably not as popular around the world, but this is sort of, I think, the original hamburger. This is the one that's served at like the style of burger that's served at diners, roadside stands, and places like that around the U.S. The drive-through burger. So it's a burger that's cooked on a griddle. So instead of a live fire, it's cooked on a flat piece of metal, like a plancha. I don't know what you call it in Italian. But on a flat hot piece of metal. And this burger is not so much, they're generally thinner, so it's not really about that contrast between the interior and exterior. It's much more just purely about the development of flavor through browning, through the Maillard reaction. The Maillard reaction is the reaction that occurs when you brown a piece of meat, or brown anything through heat. What happens is that proteins and sugars break down, and then this cascade of chemical reaction occurs that produces all these new flavorful compounds. So where at one point you had maybe just a few different aromatic compounds, you end up with hundreds of them, and so you develop a much more complex aroma, much more complex flavor. And so a burger like this is really about trying to maximize all of the flavor you get out of that browning reaction. The way you brown things is through heat. And so when I designed my recipe for this type of burger, what I really wanted to do was absolutely maximize the browning. So rather than starting with a single thicker patty, I use two smaller patties because double the patties means you get double the amount of browning. And then I use this tool. This is the tool that you use to spread mortar on the floor when you're putting tiles on the floor. It's really good for smashing down burgers. But the idea here is that you don't put any oil on the pan at all because you actually want the burger to stick. You want it to completely maximize contact so that you're absolutely maximizing the amount of conduction between the hot metal and the burger. The other method I use here is unilateral cooking, so cooking almost completely through on one side, because what I found is that you get much deeper flavor by browning one side of a food very, very deeply, as opposed to only mildly browning both sides of the food. So we're cooking it almost all the way through just on one side, and then we use this razor. It's what you use to take wallpaper off the walls, or paint off the walls. You use it to scrape off all of the meat, so you get 100% of the browning. This is American cheese, which is different from cheese made in America. There are many very, very good artisan-made cheeses in America. American cheese is the processed yellow stuff that you get at the supermarket, Kraft cheese. And I know a lot of people have a lot of disdain for American cheese. And I think the problem is that it's called cheese, and if it was just called something else, nobody would have much of a problem with it. It is made with cheese, but it also has emulsifying agents. It has sodium citrate, a couple of other emulsifying agents, plus some extra milk added to it. The whole purpose of American cheese is that it melts very well. So no, it doesn't taste very strongly. If you eat it while it's cold, it has the texture of plastic. But when you get it in between two hot hamburger patties, it is like it's like the glue that holds it's like the carpet that ties the whole room together. It's nothing else melts like it. And so, and for me, I would rather have a slice of American cheese with the way it melts, and be able to taste the beef, so that the flavor of the burger comes mainly from the beef. The cheese is mainly there just for texture. And if you actually put like a stronger tasting cheese on there, it kind of distracts from the beef. So I'd say put the good cheeses on the cheese plate, and put the American cheese on the hamburger. Where'd the hamburger go? Anyhow, that's how I make my griddled hamburgers. So again, we go back to the question of why science. I'm going to very, very quickly jump through maybe like a half dozen fun, surprising techniques, things you can do that have good scientific explanations for why you do them. One of them, add vodka to batter. So when we were in Bologna, we had some really good fried artichokes. It's artichoke season right now. We had some really good deep fried artichokes. If you're battering things and frying them, try replacing some of the liquid in there with a little bit of vodka, or any hard liquor, grappa, whatever, any hard liquor. The reason being that when you're frying things, you kind of want to maximize surface area. That's the whole point of adding a batter. You're maximizing surface area so that you maximize crunchiness. Vodka is much more, alcohol is much more volatile than water. So when you put it into, when you put a batter that has been made with hard alcohol into the hot oil, it bubbles much more vigorously, and so you end up with bigger bubbles, more surface area, and you end up with crunchier food. So try it next time. Maybe replace about 50% of the liquid with a hard spirit. Add vodka to a pie crust. Same idea, different concept. So in this case, when you're making a pie crust, and I don't know how many of you have worked with pastry a lot, but one of the difficult parts of pastry is that if you add a lot of extra liquid to it, if you add a lot of extra water to it, gluten develops in the flour and it becomes tough. Gluten is a good thing in pizza dough. It's a good thing in bread. It's not a good thing for most pastries. You don't want much gluten to develop because you want the pastry to stay nice and light and crisp. But if you don't put enough water in it, the dough becomes very crumbly. It's very difficult to work with. So the temptation is to add more liquid. Well, it turns out you can add a liquid. It's just not water. If you add extra alcohol to it, it makes the dough very easy to work with, very, very supple, very smooth. But when it bakes, it doesn't develop gluten in the same way, so that when it bakes, all that alcohol burns off. It comes out as if you had made it with very little liquid, but the dough becomes much easier to work with. Reverse sear steaks. This is something that I think maybe you'll talk about tonight. Dario might talk about tonight a bit. Anyhow, this is a technique I developed at Cooks Illustrated like 10 years ago now, I guess, but maybe more. But the concept stems from sous vide, where you're cooking something at a very low temperature first, and then searing it at the end. I think this method actually works better than, you end up with better results in sous vide. The idea is that you take your piece of meat, and instead of doing the traditional method where you sear it very hard at the beginning and then put it into the oven to slowly cook through, you reverse it. You start at very low temperature in the oven, you wait until it's cooked almost all the way through, and then just before serving, you sear it to give it color on the crust. What you find is that well, searing is a process that takes a lot of energy. And the part of searing that takes energy, there's three different things. So there's raising the temperature of the meat. There is evaporating the liquid in the meat, on the surface of the meat, and then there's the energy it takes to actually start browning it. So you really want to get to the browning phase as fast as possible in order to efficiently and effectively brown meat. It turns out it takes an awful lot of energy to evaporate liquid. So if you have a gram of water, it takes 100 calories to take it from 0 degrees to 100 degrees Celsius. It takes 5 times more energy than that to then just get that gram of water to evaporate. So most of the energy that is spent when you're searing a piece of meat is not about changing the temperature of the meat. Most of the energy comes from actually evaporating the excess liquid in it. So if you take your meat and you start it in a low temperature oven first, wait until it gets evenly cooked all the way through, the exterior by that point has dried out very, very nicely. So there's not going to be much exterior moisture on there. So then when you sear it, you can sear it much, much faster, and you end up with less overcooked meat underneath. So you get more even cooking and a better crust in the end with this method. This one people might scoff at, but freeze basil before you make pesto out of it. And in fact, this goes for anything that you're pounding in a mortar and pestle. I hope everyone makes their pesto in a mortar and pestle and not in a food processor. It makes a very big difference. And you might think that a food processor is more violent. It's going to draw out more flavor from the pesto, from the basil. But it actually isn't. If you think about it, if you think about like your basil leaf as a stack of like shipping containers, and there's flavorful juices inside those shipping containers. The way a food processor works is it spins around with a blade, and it ends up shearing the cells apart. Sometimes through the cell, but sometimes also in between them. So it's sort of like a hurricane comes and knocks over those shipping containers. They're all scattered around. They look like they've been messed up, but a lot of them are still intact, and the flavor is not coming out of them. When you pound something in a mortar and pestle, it's like Godzilla comes and steps on those containers and squashes them open. So when you pound something, you actually get a lot more flavor out of it than you do with a food processor. So where the freezing comes into place is Well, freezing also destroys cell texture. If you freeze a vegetable, what happens is ice crystals form inside. Those ice crystals have very sharp edges, and they end up ripping apart the cell structure. This is not a good thing if you want your vegetables to remain crisp and bright and fresh, but if you're going to be pounding them into a paste anyway, it actually is a good thing. It actually helps them develop flavor. It pulls out flavor from them even faster. And since you're completely destroying it and pounding it anyway, the texture-wise, you don't notice any difference in the end. The only thing you notice is that it actually is more flavorful. So I always take my basil, put it in the freezer about 15 minutes before I make pesto out of it, and you get better flavor. Same thing goes if you're like making a Thai curry paste, something like that, or you're making guacamole where you're pounding like onions and cilantro. Freeze it before you pound it, and it works better. If you want to get peelable eggs, this one I boiled hundreds and hundreds of eggs to figure this out, and I had people peeling them without knowing how I had cooked them. So I had friends come over and peel dozens and dozens of eggs and tell me, and then I counted the number of dimples on them, and I had them tell me how difficult they were to peel. As it turns out, the main thing, freshness of the eggs can make a difference. Fresher eggs are harder to peel, but the main thing that makes eggs easier to peel is the temperature of the water that you're starting them in. So if you put eggs into cold water and turn up the temperature, the egg ends up fusing to the shell. If instead you bring the water to a boil first, and then put the eggs in, the protein sets up really, really fast, and it doesn't fuse to the shell as much. So if you want eggs that are easy to peel, start them in hot water as opposed to cold water. Even easier, actually, is to steam them. What I do these days is I put maybe an inch of water in the bottom of a pot. You don't even need like a steamer basket or anything, just an inch of water in the bottom of the pot with the lid. Get it until it's steaming hot, and then just put the eggs right there, and they cook exactly the same as if they were fully submerged and boiling. Anyhow, so I guess I just want to close up with the question of why science again. And one question that a lot of people ask me is does studying the science of food destroy the art or the culture of food? And I think absolutely not. Like I think some people have this idea that there's this dichotomy between science and art. I think the opposite. I think they go hand in hand. I think of it sort of in the way that if you're a musician. There's a certain element of music that involves your emotion and what you feel towards the piece and the emotion that you give to the audience. But in order to be able to do that properly, you have to practice your scales. You have to practice your exercises, and you have to have the sort of technical knowledge of how to get that emotion across. And with food, it's the same thing. I think understanding the technique behind cooking and understanding the science behind it is what gives you the tools to be able to express yourself or express your culture or express whatever you want. Rather than stealing from the art, I think it actually enhances it and allows you to really be in control of it. And yeah, I think I'm out of time, but I'm also out of things to say, which is convenient.
So,
yeah.
so Grazie. Grazie a Kenji. Questo è l'earphone. Vi ricordo, il suo libro io l'ho comprato su Amazon e l'ho divorato. Purtroppo non è prevista per ora un'edizione italiana, ma lo potete trovare senza problemi su internet. Abbiamo qualche minuto. Volevo farti una domanda. Io trovo che uno dei piatti più difficili da cucinare bene sono le patate arrosto, roasted potatoes. Volevo sapere, anzi in realtà so che tu hai studiato il problema, come ottenere delle buone patate arrosto che siano morbide all'interno e che però siano croccanti all'esterno e saporite. Volevo sapere se puoi dare qualche consiglio al pubblico su come ottenere delle patate arrosto perfette.
Yeah. Sure. Roasted potatoes, yeah. So when you're roasting a potato, there's a couple things you want. You obviously want it to be completely cooked through, and you want it to be moist and tender on the inside. But for me, I want it to be extremely crispy and crunchy on the outside. So you have that sort of textural contrast between the soft interior and the crispy exterior. So if you take a potato and just cut it, maybe toss it with some oil and put it in the oven, as soon as you pull it out of the oven, it's going to be crispy on the outside, but you'll find that that layer of crispness is actually very, very, very thin. And what happens is as the potatoes sit, the steam from the inside comes out and it ends up making that layer soft. So within 30 seconds, the potatoes go from crispy to being completely soft again. So what you really need to do is find a way to make that layer thicker, to come up with a thicker, crispy layer. One way to do it is to boil the potatoes first and then roast them. And this is a very common technique. What I like to do is I'll boil them until they're almost overcooked, and then take them into a bowl with some oil and toss them very, very vigorously. And that ends up creating sort of like this layer of mashed potatoes that coats each piece, so that when you then roast it, that potato layer dries out and has a lot more surface area and becomes much crisper. If you want to get it even better, what you can do is take a little bit of baking soda and add it to the liquid, about I don't know in grams and liters, probably 5 grams per liter, something like that, of baking soda. And what that does is that, so all vegetable cells are held together with pectin, which is like, it's like the mortar in between the bricks, the cement that holds it together. Pectin, it breaks down with high heat, about 185 degrees Fahrenheit, so what is that, 70 degrees Celsius maybe? Yeah. 75 degrees Celsius. It breaks down with high heat, but its breakdown is also affected by pH. So in more acidic environments, it'll actually hold together better. And in more basic environments, more alkaline environments, it'll actually fall apart more. So if you take your potato and cook it in water with a little bit of baking soda, you can get that exterior to actually turn, just the outer layer to turn much softer than the interior, so that your potato still retains its shape and still retains some bite in the middle, but that outer layer becomes very soft so that when you subsequently roast it, and I roast in a relatively hot oven, so but when you subsequently roast it, it becomes much crisper. So the basic process is take your potatoes, put them into water with a little bit of baking soda and salt, boil them until they're soft on the exterior, put them in a bowl, some olive oil or maybe some pork fat or whatever, duck fat, and toss it very, very vigorously, and then put it onto a tray and roast it in a hot oven, 230 degrees Celsius, for about 45 minutes. And you end up with a potato that is incredibly, incredibly crisp on the outside, but still nice and moist in the middle.
Quindi provate a bollire le patate con un po' di bicarbonato e provate a seguire il suo consiglio. Abbiamo tempo per una domanda, perché poi dobbiamo uscire. Quindi se qualcuno vuole fare una domanda veloce, va bene, vengo lì. There's one question.
Yes, hello. I found that
Ammiro moltissimo questo signore che parla con una velocità pazzesca, supersonica. Però le dico una cosa, siccome lei è un bel giovanotto e molto giovane, ci vorrà tanta esperienza per riuscire a fare da mangiare come forse vorrebbe fare. Ci sono state solo le nostre nonne e adesso qualche signora che come media avrà 90 anni. E quelle erano cose molto buone.
Qual è la domanda, signora?
La domanda è questa: ci vuole poco a farla mangiare bene, i prodotti di prima qualità, cioè della terra, della campagna, e una grande volontà.
Vabbè, ok. Abbiamo... Non è una domanda, signora, questa non è una domanda, guardi, abbiamo poco tempo, prego. Prego.
Yes, hello. I found everything you said absolutely fascinating, but I have a curiosity, especially about the basil, freezing the basil.
Okay.
I happen to had a lot of basil and a little time, so I did my pesto with a blender, of course.
Right.
Then I put the pesto in the freezer. Is there any chance that this will accidentally improve the flavor?
Accidentally improve it. I actually, when I was doing that, I actually did a test at the same time, where I took basil, put it in the freezer, and then made it in the blender and compared it to pesto made with fresh basil in the blender. So basil that's been blended and put in the freezer, or put in the freezer and then blended, it'll actually come out a little bit better than pesto that's just made in the blender, but it won't be as good as pesto that's then pounded.
As I do have lots of blended pesto. This is a good
yeah, I'm
news.
sure it'll be delicious.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Va bene, ringraziamo Kenji allora con un applauso e ci vediamo pomeriggio per tutte le altre conferenze. Grazie.
Thank you.
really have a good time tonight, and tonight we're going to